Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're in our series called Public Land Beating the Odds, where we dig back into the strategies, mindsets, and approaches to be successful on public land despite the many challenges that come with it. And again, this season is all about how to consistently take the top deer where you hunt, and our guest this week is no stranger to that. This episode is part 2 with Jared Scheffler of Whitetail Adrenaline, and we get more specific with some interesting topics we just touched the surface on last time. And we have a free journal, a great way to track and apply what we talk about in this podcast, and you can download that. It's linked below. Okay, so here are the top things to look for during this episode. What are the 2 main bear holes Jared says you have to focus on that will give you the most advantage hunting public land? Remember, a bear hole is a big thing to fill versus rabbit holes are very minute things. How does Jared find many pockets of good bucks that elude other hunters? How does Jared adjust on the fly to get on big deer consistently? What is the problem with e-scouting today that makes it much less valuable than most think? How does Jared hunt scout a parcel to determine its hunting value or see if it's worth his time to even hunt? And there's a whole lot more good stuff there in this podcast as usual, so let's get to it and up your deer IQ. All right, so I'm back with Jared Scheffler of Whitetail Adrenaline. In part 1, if you missed it, you're going to want to go back and listen to that because we talked about some really, I say, key things about getting into public land hunting. And if you're a guy that struggles with that, if you maybe are just getting into that, there's some things we discussed there that's really going to be helpful to you to check out. But in this episode with Jared, we're going to dive a little deeper and go a little more advanced here into a couple of things he talked about that I thought were really interesting, but also I think pivotal for guys that he brought up is like these 2 main, he called them bear holes, which are big things that we need to be able to tackle basically to have consistent success, right? There's really small things and there's big things. So we're going to take a couple of these big things and then start working our way into some minutia, some details about just how to do that, right? So welcome back, Jared, first of all.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And let's dive right into that. So one of them you talked about, I think you said it's the number 1 thing, which is how to figure out just where to hunt, right? You said, I think, 90% or so of public land is probably not worth hunting. And being able to figure that out is key, and so you're not wasting your time hunting places where other guys are already screwing it up or whatever it is, right? And there's no deer there or whatever. So let's start there. Like, what is that process for you so you can eliminate all this land and get down to where, okay, I want to hunt here?
Yeah, and as far as that 90%, that's not like necessarily a hard 90%. Like in Michigan, it might be 97% is not worth your time. In Iowa, it might be 60 or 50% is not worth it, but a bulk of the acreage is generally, and it can change a little bit at different times of the year too. So I don't want people to get too fixated on, well, that's 90%, it's just
keeping track and
doing
math.
Not, that's a rabbit hole. It's not
right.
The general idea here is just a lot of acreage is not worth your time. Get really efficient at eliminating acreage. And then that moves into the second rabbit hole of having a style of hunting and everything that is very adaptable and very mobile. That was kind of the second bear hole. And I lost my train of thought here a little bit. Is that the one that you want hit on a little bit more?
Well, yeah, let's start with the first one. So how do you really narrow down where you want to hunt, right? Like, what does that look like?
Well, it states like Michigan have more bigger cities than, say, a state like, and more overall hunting pressure throughout the state than let's just take a Western state, for example, right? So It's going to be a little bit trickier in that state to eliminate acreage based on, say, populations necessarily. Whereas like in a western state, I can pull up a map and see where a handful of the big cities are in the state and try to get over an hour away from those to pick my general starting point of that state. Whereas that might be trickier to do in a state like Michigan or Wisconsin, where I grew up. And we learned this years ago in Wisconsin, where we would, if we had, and this is in the videos, I don't think we really talked about it too much in the videos, but my cousin Jim and I mean, a lot of times we'd have 2 hours left. He'd get off of work and we have 2 hours before dark. And it was we found we were way better off to drive an hour, to hunt an hour, versus hunt something that's 15 minutes. And now we got 145 minutes of hunt time with 2 hours left versus an hour. But the quality of, the lack of pressure and the quality of hunting acreage, right? So that's kind of what we learned. So depending on where an individual's located, they can kind of dissect that, and maybe that, I don't want to say it's a rule, like get an hour away, but just think about that. Now, if you're in an area where there's pressure everywhere and you can't get away from it, then you're going to have to be a little bit more crafty, just like the deer are, at figuring out where those little mini pockets exist within that public where they're going to be at, because for the most part, everything's getting hit, but there's going to be little spots close to the road, or little, or ways you can take a canoe in or utilize a boat, and you can or very hilly terrain, maybe you can trek a little further, so that one's really hard to just like pinpoint. Like if we pinpointed a region or a state, for instance, or a part of a state, it's a little easier to formulate how I'm going to approach that to minimize acreage. It kind of changes depending on the area and where you're at. So kind of in those more pressured states, if I could drive an hour to get away from that pressure, that's what I'd do as the starting point to eliminating acreage.
So side question here. Yeah. So you grew up in Wisconsin, you're now in Iowa, right?
Correct. Yep.
Is that part of the reason why you moved out there?
It really was bottom of the list of the reasons I moved to Iowa. Okay. Years ago, I contemplated moving to Iowa a decade ago, at least. And I said, I'm not going to move to Iowa because of the deer. That's not going to be the top checklist. And I wasn't really even considering moving to Iowa too much, although I did about 6 years ago, maybe. I was actually going to move to Iowa. But then a couple of years ago, where I lived in Wisconsin, I rented, and the guy wanted to sell the house, and I wasn't interested in buying. And I thought, well, what's holding me back from Iowa? And I kind of went through the checklist, and I was like, yeah, it makes sense for me on every point I could come up with. And so that's why I moved. And
gotcha.
And then, it's nice to have the deer tags too. So.
Why not? Yeah. So I think that is a good point. It really depends on your area, and the pressure of your area as to how you might go about that, right? Wisconsin versus Iowa type thing is an example. So away from cities, right, or away from these, basically those are high pressure areas where guys can easily just pop out and go hunting as a starting point, right? Or finding mini pockets. Let's get into the mini pockets. So in Michigan, that's kind of where I sit, right? Like last year I took a Pope and Young buck on Michigan Public.
Nice.
Which is a big deal here. And I was navigating so many hunters. It was ridiculous. Like I literally pulled up, I'd been watching these group of bucks actually. There was a handful that were like in that range in this one area. And I'm like, everybody's going to see these deer because I was glassing them, right? And I pull up the first time to hunt. It was like the first week, but it wasn't the first day. There was the conditions weren't right. But anyways, I pull up that first time and I was pretty nervous about it. I'm like, okay, and I pull up there, and in the block that was adjacent to it, I saw like a bunch of trucks lined up in that block. I'm like, okay, bunch of guys in there. I pull around the corner and pull up where I'm gonna hunt, and there's like 4 cars there, and I'm like, oh, But the funny thing was they were all in that same block. So there was like 8-10 guys in one block, and I went over in the next block and was able to shoot that one. But that's what I'm dealing with in these, the mini pockets, right? So they might have been getting pictures of these same deer in that chunk.
That's where my mind went.
Yeah, and so they're all hunting over there. Maybe
and those deer are going to adapt on the fly right away. Right.
And I had a little better intel, about where they were actually staying and where they could actually be shot, and I capitalized on it, right? So let's talk about some details of that. Like if you're in a state like that, maybe Wisconsin, a Michigan, a Pennsylvania, whatever, and you find that it's hard to get away from guys totally. What are you looking for? How do you find these mini pockets?
Kind of just what you just described there. You kind of recognize and you could kind of sense probably through different indicators that pressure, when you pulled up that day, right? You couldn't necessarily pre-plan that, right? That you maybe predicted that something like that, but quite often you're evaluating that on the fly and like, okay, that vehicle, you don't always 100% know which side of the road or where they went, but you can kind of pick up on a few little things after you get enough experience that you're like, or maybe it's just rained and you can see the tracks of where those hunters went and things. And that's some of that defense too. I wouldn't really call that defense, because you're not necessarily, you're using that to obtain information on where the hunting pressure is, not trying to keep the hunting pressure from figuring out where you're hunting. So, but yeah, big bucks don't like people,
Oh, yeah.
and deer don't. Okay, there's city deer and examples, but even those deer are pretty witty on what's a human threat, and what is not a human threat.
Yep.
And so, there's so many different little, you can do it by cities a bit, but that's not the details of what you were talking about of pulling up that road and really, maybe there's a maybe there's a human path, to where it's like pretty easy to dissect that, and figure out like, okay, we've got 1,000-acre piece, but somewhere within here is probably a 10-acre nugget that people are overlooking. And so, or it's too much of a pain to get to, or you can only get to it by water, or it's just like we talked about, just straight up overlooked. And then, and if there is enough pressure and everything's fairly easily accessible, oftentimes there's enough pressure that goes within that it bumps them back out closer to the roads. If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. No,
my first day hunting with a gun, our entire strategy, and I knew this from hearing my dad's hunting stories, and I was a part of gun hunting before I was 12. I just couldn't actually carry a firearm. So we'd do deer drives and things like that. So I was fairly on point. But the first year that I was able to hunt with a gun, like my dad already knew where quite a few of these pockets were going to be after a few hours of gun season opening up. And we had a big public land swamp, and he usually a little before noon, somewhere between 10 and noon, would want to go into this one little pocket that we'd park right off a highway. and it was legal to park off this particular highway. It was not an interstate, but before we even exited the vehicle, we had a big one spotted. 150 yards off the highway out in the cattails. So we had to play, and we had shotguns and stuff. So smoothbore shotguns. So, I mean, it took us, I don't know, a half hour to probably get in there or so, and shot him at like 15 yards. It was a 13 pointer, a pretty big buck for that particular area. I had been in there, actually that strikes my memory. I had been in there probably within 100 yards of that. I think I was 9 years old. Like I said, I was a part of gun hunting, but one of my older brother's high school friends had joined us for a couple of days of hunting, and we executed a small drive, and we had spotted a big one off the highway in the cattails and stuff on that deal when I was 9. And I went in with him, and I sat with him, and he was the stander for pushing this. I think my dad drove this big buck to him. And I stayed down low, so I wasn't observing, but I remember I was chirping at him, just wait till he gets, in our laps here, because he had a smoothbore shotgun, or whatever. And, and that wasn't as big of a buck, but it was a nice 9-pointer, and he was thrilled with it. So, but identifying and figuring out where those pockets are, it's really, really beneficial on the public land setting. So
yeah, and some of that is in that circumstance, in that example, is historical knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So hunters typically do this, in these areas. They typically hunt these places. The deer typically react this way, and so your dad knew those pockets, right? And so, okay, after this amount of time, we go here. That's knowing the other hunters, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the in the moment stuff that we're kind of talking about is you don't know from year to year. It seems like sometimes hunters pound this piece one year and the next year there's nobody there and you don't know why. Maybe it's crop rotation stuff. Maybe it's just they all got mad at each other last year. So they said, I'm not hunting there next year. And then nobody does, or there's all these variables you can't totally predict,
right?
And
you can adapt on the fly. That's
right. Yeah. So let's talk about that. Then the adaptation on the fly. What does that look like for you? How do you go about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's just take your example of pulling up that road. You maybe already had it planned that you were going to go into that pocket, but if I was pulling up it for the first time, I'd use that same kind of mentality of. And I did this a few years, not a few years ago, feels like a few years ago, 9 years ago. I was in a new part of the state. I had never hunted there before. It was in Iowa, but it was it was one of the low draw areas, so which is why I put in for it. I got it. I drew it in 1 year, and I had 3.5 or 4 days to hunt. I had a very small window of hunt time, and my general format, whether I've got 5 days to hunt or a week or 2 weeks, it's those first few days are going to be the same strategy. It's for the most part, I'm going to be driving by tons of public acreage and just getting a basic overview of what the terrain actually looks like in person, where's the pressure, what's getting hit, what looks like it's been getting hit for a while. And I'm going to eliminate thousands and thousands and thousands of acres and not waste a bunch of time getting too invested into something that's not worth my time. And the first 2.5 days roundabout of that, and we, on a handful of occasions, did leave the vehicle and go into some pieces, and they weren't that great. But it was about 2.5, 3 days in, and we didn't have much time left on the hunt. But I kind of picked up on a pocket that it was getting used by people, but not so much by hunters, I didn't feel. And probably because it was getting used by people daily, like walking paths and hiking paths through it, I was like, that's probably deterring a lot of hunters. And there's probably some little nuggets just off the main walking trails that is low pressure and just off enough that the deer feel comfortable with it. And I wasn't wrong on that evaluation. Although I will say there was about 30-acre pocket that I targeted off the trail, and we went in there and still hunted our way through that, and it was not very productive. And we were on our walk out, and there was a tiny little nugget that I had to pop up over this hill just off the walking trail. And it was probably 80 to 100 yards to the private line. And I kind of peeked up over that little ridge, and I did.
Okay, so here is your high IQ moment. Being adaptable and mobile are key characteristics of consistent public land hunters. But that not only means with your gear, but also mentally. Are you mobile in your thinking? You see, it's easy to slap on a mobile stand or saddle, but still hunt the same spots over and over again, which really isn't being mobile at all. To the deer, that's pressure, just like a permanent stand or blind would be. Not getting married to spots, emotionally attached, or in ruts with where you hunt are more vital than exact gear you use. So get out of the mental rut and find various ways and angles to hunt your areas. That is more important than how you're hanging from a tree. That's an adaptable mentality that will really help you out and is something to think about. And if you want a detailed guide with 8 new approaches to beat the odds and the crowds on public land, check out our free public land hunting guide. It's compiled from many of our expert guests from this show and also some things that I've learned over the many years of hunting successfully on public land. It's a big help, and you can find that below. Also, check out the Deer IQ services we have, including private land plans, getting a Deer IQ test and consultation, and our newly announced Advanced Whitetail Workshop now taking registrations. Details are below for all of those and how you can sign up. All right, and now let's get back to the podcast.
And I kind of peeked up over that little ridge, and I did it a little too aggressively and a little too fast. And there was two real big bucks there. And I was like, and they got me. The one got me, but the other one knew something was up. And then probably 400 or 500 yards away from that, I got into another big buck. That was a really tough scenario to pull off, but I got the visual. So I was able to kind of, in a few days, I mean, I don't know how many miles we traveled, but I think we started about 30, 40 miles from there originally, and dissected and gained a lot of intel on where the pressure is and things like that. And what I just described, I mean, it was a fairly mainly wooded setting. We weren't, it's not like we were getting these visuals on these deer from the vehicle. We were just strictly dissecting it, figuring out where those pockets are and that might hold a big buck, and then going in. And I came back, I drew the tag again the next year, and I again only had 3.5 days, and I popped right back in to those pockets pretty much. I think I spent a half a day in the vehicle, just kind of like as sun came up, just kind of feeling things out, and then I went in and got into a mega buck in the one pocket, and I would have killed him, I'm sure, with a compound, but I played chess with him for a couple of days. So anyways, I can't remember exactly. I think that pretty well kind of wrapped up the.
Yeah, so you're kind of starting, and this is where. So we're talking Iowa here, right? With this scenario.
This particular scenario, yeah.
But you can apply that to a lot of places, and a lot of guys will hunt out of state. So next year, this coming year, I drew a Kansas tag. So I'm going to be going out there, only my second time. And so I'm going to be trying to apply similar scenarios, right? How do I narrow the spots down to the spot or two where I need to spend time? And a lot of guys might do this, and this can work some. Time of year might change things too if it's the rut. And I can maybe e-scout some good funnels and maybe have some success, right?
Potentially. A lot of that stuff, because public land pressure has rose because of a number of variables. One, it's free.
Yep.
Two, it might be their only option, the hunter's only option. Three, it's actually turned into kind of like a cool challenge thing for hunters.
Yep.
Now I don't when I go to like a plain state like Kansas during the rut, I may pick my area a little bit more off of the big cities, but that pressure is you have to adapt that day, because you got pheasant hunters coming in hourly, potentially. It can change so quick. So, I mean, those deer are getting pushed daily. Like, they're getting pressured daily from different, how do I say this? Pheasant hunters could move into a piece, blow the big bucks out, and then other pheasant hunters 2 hours later on private over here could flush a big buck out that doesn't know that pheasant hunters were just in on this piece. And he ends up on that. It just falls around. So in that particular state, I will generally kind of, but not always, use the big cities as just kind of like, I'm going to get away from there to start. But as far as the daily pressure goes, I don't really generally hold too much, because it just, especially once pheasant season opens, it can change in a matter of minutes. I mean, I have literally seen pheasant hunters come through a piece of public and they're jumping in the vehicles to go to the next piece, and a big buck floats in on the north end of it while they're leaving, that he doesn't realize they were just in there. So if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and I guess if I understand your strategy, it's spending more time driving around and just looking at the lay of the land, the pressure that's currently there, and then making your decisions from that. Because I think a lot of guys now, and apps can be beneficial in some ways, but I think they maybe rely on them too much. Like, okay, I've done all this e-scouting, and these are these two areas I'm going to hunt, and they just decide, I'd say, based on that, and they've never even been there yet.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. E-scouting worked a lot better in its infancy, but now people have gotten so educated and it's so accessible on the phone that everything that looks good,
everybody's there.
Yeah,
it's funny. Yeah. No, I call that I call it the Disneyland mentality, because everybody's reading the same playbook now, right? Oh, I got to go back to the swamp, this blah, blah, blah. And when I scout this stuff in the spring and winter, that's where I see all the stands, is these inaccessible spots that you can see easily, on your app. So it's almost like now, okay, you might want to check that stuff out in the off season or whatever. It could be good, but there's a good chance you're going to see a bunch of guys there just like you, and almost avoid those spots now. So you're right.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of reverse it around, like, okay, all those little nuggets, those are no longer, so the deer don't process it the same as we do, right? They just go off of, okay, there's pressure here.
Right.
They don't think inaccessible to hunters. They just, okay, this is a little pocket that's not getting pressure. This is where I can hang out and be comfortable, and I can see a hunter coming. I can smell him. I can hear him, whatever. But as soon as it gets pressured, they abandon it. They adapt.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. They don't have an app. They don't really care about boundaries and all that
Right.
stuff. Right.
Right.
So let's say you find a piece like these little nuggets you talk about, and you're going to go in and hunt. Can you take us through like a scenario, or like, okay, this is what I'm now focused on. These are some of the details of my, I call this a surgical type hunt.
Yeah.
What does that look like for
Yeah.
Jared?
So let's just take timber, for example. I mean, I might spend, like I said, a couple of days in the vehicle in a new area, driving around a lot of timber, not expecting to get a visual on a big buck, but just more or less eliminating the acreage and figuring out where the pressure is, and getting a general. Okay, I might drive by 30 pieces of public, and I'm trying to narrow it down to 2 or 3 pieces that I want to actually target for a few, a day or 2 days or whatever, or a portion of it. So if it's timber, I, just, okay, let's say I've selected, okay, I think this is worth my time. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to try to first picture where a big buck might be. And then obviously look at the wind direction and approach it accordingly to that. As far as the pace that I'm going to still hunt, so I'm not going in to, generally, very rarely am I going in with a set agenda of this is where I want to get to, and I'm going to set up shop there. I'm going in and I kind of want to work this ridge and I want to loop around like this. I don't really have a destination generally picked of point A to point B, and then I'm going to set up shop there. I'm going to go in and still hunt it because I'm still actually trying to decide whether this is worth my time. And so that's where the fine line of, well, I don't want to spend all day in this piece. Let's say it's 100-acre piece or 200. And I mean, it might be 1,000-acre piece, but I'm kind of more focused on this 100-acre portion.
Right.
Of it, right. So I've already kind of in my head eliminated all this other acreage around, but this pocket within this 1,000 acres, I'm going to go in and I'm kind of going to hook like this. And I'll kind of pre-plan a loose, what you described, I think, in the first, a loose plan. Because as I get in there, I might kind of adjust my route, or maybe I get a visual on something and that changes everything. And I'm going to move at a pace generally of fast enough I can cover enough ground and get out of there and get back in the vehicle and move on to the next piece if it's not productive, but yet slow enough that I can probably get the visual before they ever see me, which, depending on the terrain and setting and wind conditions and things like that, that pace can only be determined at the time.
Right.
And with that setting and all those variables.
I think that's
obviously
a key.
A high wind day, you're getting away with noise.
Right.
You're getting away with movement. And so you can move at a faster pace than on a slow wind day, if that kind of makes sense. And I'll loop up through and do, kind of filter through. And, I'm taking in some of the, all the things we talked about already. Like, as I'm going through it, it's like, okay, do I get the feeling this has been getting pressured? And I'm taking in, the normal deer sign information too, of tracks and rubs and scrapes, but I'm keeping it loosely, like we talked about, like I'm noticing it, whether it's there or not, and whether it appears that there's pressure or not. And if by the end of my journey, I don't get a visual on a big buck, I'm going to evaluate everything else within that and decide whether I'm going to come back or if I'm completely abandoning, and I might not have a concrete answer on that. I may be like, there was a lot of good deer sign in there. It doesn't appear anybody's hitting it. For some reason, we didn't see a deer or a big buck or much. Something's maybe off. Maybe somebody was in there trompsing around the day before and I missed the sign. And maybe if we give it 2 days, they'll be popped back in, That's kind of that adaptable. You can't really put that in a book as far as what to do in exactly this situation and scenario. That's where you get enough experience and you kind of go off of your gut instinct of like, and you might have plans to pop back in there in 2 days, but you may pop into another piece later that day and a big buck might land right in your lap and you might be tagged out and never make it back,
Right.
But then you come back to that state the next year. Maybe it's your home state and maybe you remember what you found there and it was at this time of the year and maybe it's all changed the following year or maybe it's the same. And that's where having that loose kind of, you got I don't really want to call them guidelines, but you got loose things that you just don't want to get too concrete. I see guys, they, and I was guilty of this for a long time, getting hung up on sign I found in the spring and, and all of that. That's good to have in the back of the head, but it can all change by the next fall. Crop rotation, pressure levels, all of that can change. So that's why that adaptability, it's in this game of public land hunting. I think that's the second bear hole to put dirt in.
Yeah, that's a big one. And you're going in a lot of times, you're doing this stalking or this still hunting, I guess we might call it, type scenarios. And I think that's a big one here. You went over a lot of stuff there, and I've been very guilty of this before. And it might boil down to some people's personalities, but you like pre-decide where you're going to hunt, right? And you don't have all the information you probably need to do that type thing, especially if I'm putting up a stand or whatever, and like you get it in your head for some reason that, oh yeah, this is the spot I want to be. Maybe you're e-scouting and this is what you're doing. Oh yeah, that's the pin spot right there. Or it just looks good. Or you're going off last year's intel, like, oh, I need to be on that ridge. And you might be, but if you pre-decide that, it's harder to change and interpret really what's there in the moment. And so that idea of, yeah, you got that information there. Okay, it could be, but not having gotten to the point where you've decided yet, right? You've got to get more information to tell you that this is hot right now. That's why I'm going to hunt here versus, and if you've already decided, that's harder to do mentally, right?
Right. It's you're fixated.
Yeah.
And when you're fixated, you're rigid. You're not loose and agile and nimble.
Yep.
So yeah, once you get it in your head, like this is the spot, this is where it's going to happen. This is where I've got trail cam pictures for the last 2 months of this big one. He's going to be there. And then when it all crumbles, the plan in the mind, because it was all an illusion of what could potentially, and sometimes those pre-formulated plans get executed flawlessly. Oftentimes on private land where the setting's controlled, it will at some point when the hunter plays his cards right, that plan does come to fruition. But in this game, it's really an illusion, all of that prefabricated. It's an illusion that could come to reality, but oftentimes doesn't. And so you don't want to get too fixated on the illusion. If that kind of makes sense, because it's deceptive, and it's deceptive because they're wild animals and pressure changes things and all kinds of variables. And so if we get too fixated on it, we can't adapt, and our plan crumbles, and then we wait it out and we keep waiting and we don't adapt because we got too fixated on our premeditated plan, and we don't adapt, and we have a crummy hunt, and we end up doing the same thing oftentimes back over. Spring comes, do a bunch of scouting. What happened last year? Why did my plan not come to fruition?
Right.
And then, you find the new pocket, the new sign, okay, this is what happened. and then the cycle starts all back over again. And then by fall, a similar thing happens, and the deer are just adapting and jive-jiving
right
on
way
the fly.
quicker than you are.
Yes. So I think the proper strategy for it is to get really good at being adaptable, which takes time to, put yourself in those situations, but you won't gain the skill set of adaptability and what adaptive moves to make in this scenario without actually doing it.
Right.
If that kind of makes sense.
No, it does. Really good stuff in there, Jared. As we kind of wrap up this episode, feels like they've gone really quickly, but why don't you tell us about, let listeners know about what you're doing, where they can find your stuff, all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I kind of mentioned a little bit in the first one there. The Whitetail Adrenaline videos are available on our website. We've got some retailers that have them as well. And then the Resurgence title is on digital on iTunes and Amazon, and Uncuffed, I expect by the end of this year, will be as well. It is available only for purchase. Our brand is not sponsored by companies. It is funded by the people purchasing the content. So there's no commercials, no ads. You get what you get as far as like the good, the bad, the mistakes and everything. And it's a lot of people like it because it's very well produced. It takes a lot of time to produce it. But it's something that when somebody sits down to watch, I want to hook them. If it's a 2-hour long disc, I want them to sit there for 2 hours and not feel like they got to fast forward. They can kind of just enjoy the thing unfold, the hunt experience and the adventure unfolding. So if you want to see some of these hunts that he's kind of been discussing, that's where you can check it out, right? And they are very very real, right? It's not your typical, cable TV show. It is like real hunts. And so check those out. But Jared, it was great talking. Again, thanks for coming on. Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Okay, so here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges. Are you hunting the 90% or so of land on public that isn't worth it? What are you doing to weed out that stuff and focus more on the productive spots? And those would be ones that actually have good cover, food, and are overlooked by other hunters. And next time we have 2 guests on and discuss the art of DIY hunting or freelance and how to up your skills to be a better mobile hunter. That's a good one. You won't want to miss it. And I'll see you then.